Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. While the focus is always on Pennsylvania, topics like the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Industrial Revolution, the coal and steel industries, and authors like John Updike, David McCullough, and John Grogan have a universal appeal. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This week on PA Books, Andrew Diemer, author of The Politics of Black Citizenship.
Andrew Diemer, author of The Politics of Black Citizenship, Free African Americans in the Mid-Atlantic Borderlands. What got you interested in this subject?
So it sort of came to me gradually. It was not something that I set out to write about. I was much more interested, or I thought that I was interested in general political questions, the kind of traditional political questions of the antebellum period. But as I was working on this period and working on some of these issues, I kept finding that African Americans were playing this fascinating role, free African Americans, and I was increasingly drawn toward them, this group of people who are, certainly in the places that I'm studying in the book, are formally excluded from the political process, and yet are constantly looking for opportunities to play some kind of role in shaping that political process.
Well, your title highlights the word citizenship. So what did it mean for black citizenship? What, as a free African American in Pennsylvania and Maryland, could you or could you not do?
So that's a complicated question, and it certainly is the case that citizenship was understood differently in the 19th century, certainly the early 19th century, than it's understood today. We tend today, living in a post-Reconstruction era, post-14th Amendment era, we think of citizenship as this national category, as this thing that we have as citizens of the nation, and therefore the rights of citizenship flow from that national citizenship. But this wasn't the way that that citizenship was understood. In fact, the Constitution says very little about citizenship. It uses the word citizenship, but it doesn't really define what that means, and it certainly doesn't create some sort of apparatus for enforcing what those citizenship rights are. So it was really left to the states primarily, but also to local government to decide what these citizenship rights were. So it certainly is different in Maryland and Pennsylvania, and even in a place like Pennsylvania, it's not entirely clear. There are real disagreements about what those rights are. In an abstract sense, African Americans had the right to equal protection of the law. What that meant in reality, of course, was complicated because all sorts of different levels of government are enforcing that equal protection. And so it's really something that is argued about, and yet there's no clear agreement on what exactly it means. Certainly, it didn't mean voting. It didn't mean voting in either of these places, not in Maryland at all during this period. In Pennsylvania, it seems clear that in some places African Americans could vote, depending on their jurisdiction, depending on what the kind of tradition was in these jurisdictions. In Philadelphia, almost certainly it was not the case. And it was not the case by law, but it was a case by custom and by the way that the elections were sort of organized.
Oh, it was not the case by law. It didn't say
no, yeah, so
blacks can't vote.
It's not until 1838, and that's, I talk about this in the book. In 1838, there's a constitutional convention where Pennsylvania rewrites their state constitution and explicitly makes voting a white privilege, explicitly says African Americans cannot be voters in Pennsylvania. Part of the argument for that is that the advocates for disfranchisement say, well, this has always been the case. We're just sort of enshrining it in law. The opponents say that this isn't the case, that this is a privilege that's being taken away from us. So it's really 1838 that marks that turning point in this particular privilege that we associate so much with citizenship.
So what are some of the others? I mean, be a jury trial or being on a jury or bringing a lawsuit or freedom of speech, those
so
things.
That's right.
The distinction between free whites and free blacks in Pennsylvania at the time?
Yeah, so these are particularly important for African Americans because slavery is such an immediate concern to them, right? I mean, being able to bring suit, being able to serve on a jury is important for anyone if you want to have equal access to the law, but it's particularly pressing in an environment where, if we're thinking about Philadelphia, there is a slave state 15 miles away. Delaware is a slave state, and going further, slavery is only going to become a more pervasive institution. And so there is this constant fear, legitimate fear, sometimes exaggerated perhaps, but real nonetheless, that legally free black Pennsylvanians are going to be imprisoned, accused of being fugitives from slavery, and taken into slavery without any kind of due process, right? Because they don't have to be accorded this due process. So really, for the people who I'm most concerned with in this book, it is that kind of protection that is most pressing to them. The protection of the courts, the protections of a jury trial.
Was the state government looking out for their interests?
Again, that depends on what we're talking about, and certainly there's a great diversity within Pennsylvania, and even within Philadelphia itself. So in Philadelphia in this period, there is, for most of this period until 1854, the city of Philadelphia proper is actually very small. It's what today we would think of as Center City, Philadelphia. The county of Philadelphia, what is now part of the city of Philadelphia, was its own jurisdiction. And even between these two jurisdictions, the government differed, so that depending on who was in power in these different jurisdictions, you could expect different kinds of protection of the government. But in many cases, it's very little support, very little protection that the government offers to free African Americans.
Now, you write in your book about kidnappings and fugitive slave law, and how would a free African American prove that he was free?
So you could ask for testimony from people who had known you for a long period of time. Of course, for most African Americans, the people who knew you best and could best testify to your legitimate freedom are also African Americans, which became problematic if they weren't permitted to testify. But that was typically the way that you could prove this. You would come up with some kind of testimony that you had been born in these places. It was often difficult to come up with paper that could show that you were free.
So if you were born free, you didn't have a paper that says free?
No.
But if you had been a slave and were freed?
That's right. Then you would have papers that demonstrated that you were legitimately free. So you compare Pennsylvania and Maryland at the time. So if you were a free African American living in Baltimore, which was in a slave state, what would your life have been like? Significantly more constrained. Now, it's important to note that in Baltimore, even though it's in a slave state, the vast majority of African Americans in Baltimore are in fact free. So I think it's something, depending on where we're talking about in this period, 10 to 1, 8 to 1, something like that. So the vast majority of black people there are free, and yet the laws of the state of Maryland are significantly more severe in the kinds of restrictions they place on African Americans. And then the government is in most cases even less sympathetic to the plight of free African Americans than is the government of Philadelphia and Pennsylvania.
Were free African Americans in Maryland allowed to travel? Like, could they come up to Pennsylvania or go down into the South?
So there is actually, if you can demonstrate that you are free to leave Baltimore, to travel. During this period, there's actually a significant restriction placed on people traveling into Maryland. So Maryland passes a law in 1831 stating that if you move African Americans, free African Americans coming into the state have a period of time in which they are permitted to stay, and after that they could be imprisoned if they overstay their welcome. In 1850, I think, I may be getting the date wrong, there's a more severe law passed which says that no free African Americans can come into the state at all, and if they do, they're liable to be imprisoned and auctioned off. So essentially they become slaves for a term due to coming into the state. So there's a real concern that some of these more activist free blacks from Pennsylvania are actually going to come into Maryland and upset the system of Maryland.
If you were walking around the streets of Baltimore, seeing African Americans in the street? Could you have told who was a slave and who was not?
No, absolutely not. And I guess that raises an important point, which is that some of these most severe restrictions are not always enforced, that they're very difficult to enforce some of these much more stringent laws because there isn't this kind of police state that would have enforced these laws. So in reality, African Americans, whether they're free or enslaved, are actually granted significant liberties, even if the law, if it were enforced to its letter, would have restricted some of these liberties. So I mean, this is one of the things that is really liberating for someone like Frederick Douglass when he travels, when he comes to Baltimore as a slave. He talks about a slave in the city as like a free man elsewhere because you're given these liberties. Your master is out of necessity forced to allow you to mingle among free African Americans. You can participate in some of their civic institutions. You can learn things that wouldn't be available to you elsewhere. So there really is this sort of much more complicated story on the ground that differs a little bit from what we see maybe in the statute books.
Then why would a slave in Baltimore not have run away?
Well, the consequences of being caught are severe. I mean, and that's really the largest deterrent. So once you begin to travel, then people begin to get suspicious and look for evidence that you are legitimately free, right? So if you stay put, if you're traveling around Baltimore itself, you're not going to be bothered, right? If you're going about your business, people are not going to stop you and ask for some kind of evidence that you're free. But if you get on a train, well, all of a sudden now you are under suspicion. And so there is, it becomes a little bit harder to run away if your goal is to run away to the north. Now, I mean, what happens in a lot of cases is that slaves had escaped to Baltimore and then never went any further than that. They just found those who could help them live free, and that was sort of as far as they went because there were these black institutions that could help you do this. So that was much more common.
How well did Pennsylvania and Maryland get along when it came to the issue of fugitive slaves and runaways, slave catchers?
Yeah, again, this depends on which Pennsylvanians we're talking about. So there is significant interest in Pennsylvania in getting along with Maryland. So there are lots of Pennsylvania politicians who place a great priority on being accommodating to the demands of their southern neighbors for all sorts of reasons, whether it is they want something in return or later on there's this real sense that the Union itself is threatened, right? That there are these abolitionists and Southern extremists as well who are trying to tear the Union apart. We as Pennsylvanians and maybe as Marylanders are looking to keep that Union together. And so it's very important that we get along. So there is significant political support for that kind of comedy, that kind of compromise. On the other hand, there are significant numbers of politicians, and in this case I think are responding to some of their constituents. There are lots of Pennsylvania politicians who maybe for moral reasons are concerned about being too accommodating to these Maryland slaveholders, but for political reasons as well, right? This becomes one of the very useful critiques that abolitionists make, whether they're black or white, of politicians, saying that they are, the terms they sometimes use are bending the knee to slaveholders, right? There's this, even white Pennsylvanians who don't care that much about slavery don't like the idea that slaveholders are coming into their state and dictating the kinds of laws that they can have and the government that they should have. So there is this opportunity to use this against slaveholders.
Now, you write in your book about the politics of black citizenship and talking about how African Americans, free African Americans in Pennsylvania were getting politically active. How could they be politically active without a vote? Could they be influential?
It's difficult for them, right? And I think that's why in many cases historians, when they tell the stories of free African Americans and the stories of the politics of the 19th century, tell these as kind of disconnected stories. Because if you can't vote, after all, how can you be politically active? And in fact, some abolitionists, white abolitionists in particular, made a virtue out of this. And there's a sort of strain of white abolition that says the political system is so corrupt that if you participate in it by voting, you yourself are complicit in this corruption. And some African Americans were sympathetic to this kind of argument, but I argue in the book that most of them had little use for this kind of argument and were looking for ways to influence the political system that was excluding them. And I think the key way that they did this was that they recognized that as much as white Pennsylvanians didn't believe in full equality, they did not believe that black Pennsylvanians were their equals and should be treated as their equals, there was among many white Pennsylvanians a kind of sympathy, a kind of notion that there was only so far they were willing to go. There were only so many privileges and rights of citizenship that they were willing to take away from their black neighbors. And certainly there is a lot of concern that slavery is expanding. Slavery is trying to reach its fingers into Pennsylvania. And so in this period, I think black politics takes advantage of this. It reaches out to what I call this tepid white sympathy, not because they like it, but because they recognize that this tepid sympathy is better than no sympathy at all, that there are opportunities to appeal to these kinds of, what today we would think of as racist white Pennsylvanians, because the alternative is far worse.
You do tell a story in your book about James Forten, who is walking along the street and runs across as a congressman and says, I just took a lot of my white employees to vote for you. Would you tell that story? And who was James Forten and how did he come to have white employees?
So James Forten is really one of the fascinating figures in, I think, early American history. He is this man, he's born free. He's an African-American man born free. I think his father was free, so he's not, he's somewhat removed from slavery, but he's born into fairly humble circumstances. As a young man, he serves on board a ship in the American Revolution and is taken captive, and this becomes one of the kind of, it could be apocryphal, but this is certainly a story he tells later in his life. He's given the opportunity to leave his country behind and become, a free man in Great Britain, and he refuses this. He stays a prisoner because this is his country. After the Revolution, he's employed by one of the big sail makers in Philadelphia. This is a maritime city. There's lots of sail making, lots of shipbuilding, and Forten really quickly proves his worth, and he really works his way up, and so that when his employer retires, Forten takes over the business. So this is a really lucrative business that Forten runs, and as you mentioned, he does so with lots of white employees. So he's got this kind of multi-racial labor force. And because of his business as a sailmaker, he becomes this really wealthy Philadelphian. And he becomes kind of, even those who assume and believe that almost all African Americans are inferior to whites, they quite often make an exception. They say, oh, except for this guy, James Forten, right? So James Forten becomes the exceptional black man. And I think, this is, as a little bit of an aside, this becomes a great piece of evidence that those exceptional black people have never overturned racism, right? There's always been the ability to make exceptions and say, well, that doesn't really change my general picture. So Forten's exceptional achievements don't change anyone's mind, but he does, as a result of this success, begin to take a greater and greater public role in the black community, and he has connections with white abolitionists as well, and he's got money that he uses to promote the anti-slavery cause. He's one of the chief benefactors of, in its early years, William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator. This is probably the most important abolitionist newspaper in the 19th century, published in Boston, largely supported by black subscription, including by Forten. So he really has taken on this really important role in the anti-slavery movement, in particular in Philadelphia, but really nationally as well. And yet he can't vote, right? And so despite the fact that he's one of the wealthier men in Philadelphia, he's certainly the wealthiest black man, he can't assert this, what we think of as a basic citizenship right, but wasn't available to him. And so, I think for all sorts of reasons, he and other African Americans don't press on this issue of voting early on. And yet, they do see a need to engage with politics nevertheless. And so, he runs into this gentleman on the street, and he not only, it's an interesting moment because not only has he used his influence to bring these men who work for him to the polls to vote for him, he wants this guy to know it, right? And that's a kind of politics in and of itself. I mean, that sends a message to this guy. I may not be a voter, but I control a lot of votes, right? And so when we think about being political without voting, and this is a clear case where it's not just a kind of private act of voting, but it's the public act of making it clear what kind of political influence you have that Fortin is engaging in here.
Was there a black upper class in Philadelphia at the time, or was James Fortin it?
Absolutely. So Fortin maybe is the richest of the rich, but there is, Philadelphia is, and this is part of what makes it such an interesting city from my perspective, it is the city in the north with the largest black population. Baltimore is the city nationally with the largest black population, largest free black population, I should say. Philadelphia is its sort of counterpart in the north, and there is the vast majority of black Philadelphians are, working class or lower because of the economic opportunities that are available to them are extremely constrained. But there is this, small but not too small class of men, some of whom are businessmen. So there's sort of certain businesses that are open to African Americans. But there's also, we also see pastors who are a member of this upper class. Again, not exceptionally wealthy, but this class of black Philadelphians that we would think of as the upper class is not simply the upper class by merit of its wealth, but there's a sort of extent to which education and public spiritedness provides entry into this class. So we have some men who we would think of as part of this upper class who aren't exceptionally wealthy at all, but who play a leading role in public and are well educated, and that becomes a kind of marker of their status in this class.
Now, the subtitle of your book is Free African Americans in the Mid-Atlantic Borderland, 1817 to 1863. Why'd you pick 1817 as a starting point? Did something happen then?
Absolutely. So 1817 is this moment where concerns about what the status of free African Americans is going to be in the United States becomes contentious in a way that it hadn't before. So in 1816, 1817, there's an organization that's founded in Washington, D.C. called the American Colonization Society. So it is this organization that is dedicated to creating a colony outside of the United States, in particular in West Africa. There are a couple other different opportunities, but West Africa becomes the focus of the American Colonization Society. And the idea is to encourage, by a number of means, free African Americans to emigrate to this colony. Right? It's on the model of the British colony of Sierra Leone, and this is what becomes the country of Liberia. So this is going to be the place where all of these free African Americans, or many of them it is hoped, will move, removing themselves from the United States. This is an organization that has tremendous support. Some of the leading men of the American Republic are supporters initially, and even throughout its existence, it has this kind of really influential leadership.
I want to read you something from your book. You say, not only was the society founded in the nation's capital, but from its start it held its annual meetings in the U.S. House chamber. Perhaps just as important as the ACS chose as its first president Bushrod Washington, a Supreme Court justice and nephew of the first president. And also Henry Clay was a...
That's right. And, so there are other members who are not active, but who give their name to it. So Andrew Jackson is, initially associated with it, though he's never really a colonizationist, and eventually he'll reject it. So, it's really important to this organization to establish itself as a national organization because it has its critics both north and south. So Southerners are suspicious because it smells like maybe the start of some kind of abolitionist movement, right? That's the concern here is, okay, you're talking about free black people now, but if we start allowing this organization to grow, and in particular later when it's looking for government support, is this a road that we're afraid of going down? So the fiercest defenders of slavery are extremely skeptical of this colonization society. On the other hand, we have, abolitionists who are going to fiercely oppose colonization for the opposite reason, because it is an effort to deny African Americans their birthright as Americans. So really, they're playing this game of invoking these symbols, and later on they're going to really use the 4th of July. It's going to be a fundraising day for the American Colonization Society. Pastors will give sermons in which they'll talk about how it's your patriotic duty to support this colonization society because it's this great national institution. And as you said, I mean, Bushrod Washington becomes the face of it, even though he's not really, technically active in this organization. He becomes the kind of symbolic face because, if there's one person who stands as the symbol of American nationality, as someone who stands above section or party, it's George Washington, and Bushrod is this kind of direct connection to Washington.
You say in here the American Colonization Society attracted those who desired the civilizing of Africa and those who wished to purify the United States, those who sought to benefit American free blacks and those who despised them. So what would have motivated whites to support this?
That's really the advantage and the dilemma of the colonization societies, because it sort of claims to be able to do so many different things. It appeals to people on so many different levels. Well, that's great if you're trying to appeal to as many people as possible. But when it comes to actually doing something, well, it's hard to please all of these masters. And so you have, there are really committed opponents of slavery in the North who genuinely believe that this is the best way to end slavery, who genuinely believe that there's no possibility of freeing black people and keeping them here. The only chance we have of abolishing slavery is to then create this avenue whereby, the people who will become emancipated can move. On the other hand, there are legitimately slaveholders who say this is a great chance to get rid of these free black people who are the worst threat to slavery. They support colonization, or some of them support colonization as well.
Well, you also, later in your book, in 1862, you quote Abraham Lincoln. You say the only answer he insisted was for free blacks to consent to leave the United States and settle elsewhere. Lincoln went further, informing the members of the delegation who met with him at the White House that African Americans who refused to leave the land of their birth were selfish. Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, I think Lincoln is a sort of perfect example of how colonization, it really endures. It endures beyond the Civil War. There continues to be a movement to colonize African Americans. But for someone like Lincoln, at least to my mind, there's been a lot of debate about how sincere Lincoln is as a colonizationist. I tend to think he's fairly sincere, but I think he, even more than that, he understands the political usefulness of colonization. And that political usefulness is, it's a way for someone like Abraham Lincoln to be anti-slavery and yet to distance himself from radical abolitionists, in particular abolitionists who advocate racial equality. Right? If you look at Lincoln's political career, if we think about the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858, Lincoln is constantly saying this needs to be a debate about slavery, right? I'm opposed to slavery. My opponent refuses to say he's opposed to slavery. Stephen Douglas, on the other hand, says, no, this is about how Abraham Lincoln wants racial equality, right? Abraham Lincoln is trying to make black men and white men equal. That's the real issue. So one of the ways that Lincoln and those like him can kind of counter that is to say, hey, I'm opposed to slavery, but really what's best is for these men and women to leave the country altogether because we can't live together peacefully. I'm not for racial equality, right? And so I think whether or not Lincoln is a sincere colonizationist, lots of people use colonization as a kind of shield that protects them from allegations that they are in favor of racial equality or, God forbid, race mixing, which is sort of the ultimate concern that these men have to face.
How did the African American community view the American Colonization Society?
The idea of colonizing African Americans actually precedes the American Colonization Society. So going back to the American Revolution itself, there had been various plans, certainly talk about how it would be a good idea for some African Americans, some free African Americans, to leave the country. And in fact, there was, in that period before the founding of this society, there was significant black support, though not much came of it because there really wasn't a mechanism for doing this. Once this organization is founded, however, things really change very quickly. And it changes in part, it changes, I argue, because of the language that this organization uses, which is harshly critical of African Americans, which talks about them as degraded, as incapable of being American citizens. That really turns free black people against colonization. And they're also deeply suspicious of any organization that has so many slaveholders prominently involved in it, right? Henry Clay becomes the perfect symbol of this, that even though I wouldn't say that Henry Clay is trying to use colonization to strengthen slavery. He is a slaveholder. He's a plantation owner. He has lots of slaves. This makes people deeply suspicious of his motives and the motives of his organization as a result.
Now, you do say there's a gentleman by the name of Cuffy. Was he African American?
He was mixed ancestry. So his mother is, I think, a Wampanoag. His father is from Africa. So so Cuffy is this businessman, ship captain who had trade connections in Africa, and he became. He's sort of emblematic of this colonization before the American Colonization Society. So Cuffy's vision for colonization is never one that embraces the full removal of African American people from the United States, but instead really is trying to promote this idea of sort of movement across the Atlantic, of a larger Black community that spans the Atlantic, that includes people on either side, that allows movement back and forth. And that really is, he's a man who himself has moved across the Atlantic quite a bit back and forth. And so this is really Cuffy's vision for colonization. Now, in the early years of this colonization society, he is an ally to a certain extent. But really, I think he's kind of the last of the major figures who is last major Black leaders in the United States who is a real supporter of colonization. After the founding of this society, really, it becomes a kind of badge of honor that you are an opponent of colonization. It becomes a kind of anyone who is lukewarm on colonization becomes suspect. It's hard to be a leader if you are lukewarm on colonization.
What was the argument that the African American leaders gave against colonization?
So they argued that this was their home country, that they were born here, and that any insistence that this was not their country, that only in order that they must leave it in order to become full citizens somewhere, was implicitly a denial of their right to American citizenship. And so, I should clarify here that there are some African Americans who take the colonization society up on their offer. So there are, some thousands of African Americans who do travel to Liberia. They do so because they see it as the best opportunity for themselves. Black leaders, on the other hand, make the argument that whatever is best for individuals, your individual choice is harming our collective struggle to be granted citizenship in the United States. And they even go further than that and say you are helping slaveholders, right? That this organization is sort of secretly aiding the defenders of slavery, and so in giving your name to it and in allowing them to use you, you are therefore helping slavery, right? So there's this real criticism of those who take this opportunity to find some kind of opportunity in Africa.
Did the American Colonization Society plan an actual colony, like with infrastructure and education and all that, or are they just going to drop people off at the shore and say,
so there is. I mean, there is some effort to create a government. So initially it's a colony. It'll eventually become its own republic. It'll acquire its independence. But initially it's a colony governed by this organization with the support of the U.S. government. There is continuing support for schools and for these kinds of institutions. In fact, in the book I talk about this one gentleman, Samuel McGill, who's from Baltimore, who is brought back to the United States to be educated as a physician because Liberia needs more physicians. They need doctors to take care of the sick people of Liberia. And so lots of colonizationists don't see it as simply a one-time thing where you get rid of these people and then they're no longer our problem. They do see a responsibility to continue to support this colony. So it is a kind of ongoing commitment among colonizationists. And in part that's because they see this not just as a way to solve America's race problem, but many of these colonizationists, as I alluded to earlier, are also committed to the idea of evangelizing Africa. So Liberia is going to do multiple things. It's going to remove free black people who are such a problem here and put them in the west coast of Africa. But once there, they're going to bring the blessings of American civilization and of Christianity to this, supposedly dark continent of Africa.
We talked about the life and the rights and citizenship of free African Americans in Pennsylvania and in Maryland. Did you compare it to other states? Were there other states that to the north that did it differently?
Absolutely. So, I think as a general rule, the further north and east you get, the greater the rights that are being granted to African Americans. So in a place like Massachusetts, by no means would we say that blacks are granted equal status, but there is much, so voting rights are much greater in Massachusetts. Eventually you're going to see integrated schools late in the 1850s in Massachusetts. And there's certainly a much greater sense that the government of those, eastern and northern states is going to vigorously defend the rights of their black citizens against the recovery of fugitive slaves. If we go to a place like New York, it's kind of middle. So in New York, they don't entirely disfranchise African Americans, but they create a kind of two-tiered system of voting where basically all white men are granted the right to vote, but if you're a black man, you have to own a certain amount of property in order to be granted that right. So it differs. If we go to the West, it's actually much more severe. So the states of the Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, have even more severe black codes. At least in some of those states, you have rules banning the in-migration of African Americans. So there's an effort to sort of eliminate the black population altogether. Again, how these laws are enforced is a different question, but certainly these Midwestern states have much more severe, much more restrictive black codes than in a place like Pennsylvania.
Now, this may not be a fair question because you didn't really write about it, but can you compare, do you have any sense for the citizenship rights for women, white women versus free blacks in Pennsylvania?
White women are disenfranchised, certainly. So in that sense, they are in the same boat as African Americans. Now, they are citizens in the sense that they are granted the rights of the protection of the law. They're able to sort of enjoy these other privileges of citizenship. So in that sense, they have greater citizenship rights than African American men. Beyond that, they don't have the threat hanging over them that they could be, because of these lack of citizenship, that they're going to be sort of captured and placed into slavery. So their context is somewhat different. But certainly that shows us that there is this kind of expansive, complex understanding of slavery, of citizenship, right? That there are these different classes of people who enjoy different kinds of rights, despite the fact that no one would have said women are not citizens, right? Everyone recognized that they were citizens. It's just a question of what rights they're given. This also shows that, for the most part, people, at least legally, voting was not a citizenship right. It was a privilege. It was something that was treated differently. And even if we look at the amendments that are passed after the Civil War, it's still treated differently. So the 15th Amendment treats voting as its own issue, as its own privilege. The 14th Amendment, sort of finesses this a little bit. So I think women are thinking about white women is a good way of thinking about just how complicated this situation is.
Well, another facet of it is recent immigrants. You write a little bit about the Irish immigrants to the U.S. Can you compare the citizenship rights of the recent immigrants, like the Irish, to African Americans who were born here?
Yes, I think this is a really important comparison. It's one that's useful to us, but it was one that was pointed out by a lot of people in this period. So this, especially when we talk about the 40s and the 50s, 1840s and 1850s, this is a period of really intensifying immigration, white immigration from Ireland. That's particularly what we're seeing in the cities. It's also a period of German immigration as well. But what's different about this period compared to earlier white immigration was that these are Catholics, and this is disturbing to a lot of white Protestants in what had been predominantly a Protestant country, a country that thought of itself, at least many Americans thought of the Protestant brand of Christianity as an inherent part of their political liberties as well. And so when you have this introduction of these newcomers who are practicing this very different kind of religion, and in the eyes of many intensely Protestant reformers, Catholicism is slavish. They use these metaphors of the Pope as this, tyrant who is manipulating people. So there is this real concern among lots of native-born white Americans in Philadelphia, in particular, also in Baltimore, but around the country. There's a lot of concern about these immigrants. Now, this should be qualified in that there is never a disfranchisement of these men along the lines of what we see with African Americans. There is never a notion that because they are immigrants, they should be denied the right to vote. Now, there is an effort in the 40s and especially in the 50s to lengthen the wait time that they would have to undergo in order to acquire the right of voting. This doesn't generally pass, and it's never intended to be permanent, right? There's always this sense, sort of the most extreme version of it is, and this is one, again, that's never passed, but there are some of these native-born Protestants who say they need to wait 21 years because that's what a native-born person would have to wait to vote. So there is this effort to kind of constrain voting rights in particular, and yet it never really is anything like what we see for African Americans. And in fact, whatever the desires of some of these native-born whites, very quickly these immigrant whites from Ireland and from Germany become a critical part of the Democratic Party's voting coalition, right? So not only are they not disenfranchised, but they have tremendous political power because there's so many of them. And very quickly they come to by far outweigh the numbers that we see of free African Americans, and they become this really important voting bloc in the big cities in particular.
I just want to ask you this quick aside. You say the law passed in 1820 in Pennsylvania made kidnapping a felony punishable by a fine between $500 and $1,000 and between 7 and 21 years of hard labor. Were slave catchers who came and kidnapped free blacks in Pennsylvania and took them back to Maryland, were they ever caught, arrested, punished?
They were. I guess as a little context here, this is the period of what historian Ira Berlin has called the Second Great Migration, right, or the Second Middle Passage. This is a period in which there's a booming frontier in the Southwest, in the states like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, where Americans have discovered that they can grow cotton and make extreme profits. And so as they begin to move into these places, there's a huge demand for slave labor. At the same time, the United States has closed off the African slave trade. So in 1808, there is no longer legal importation of slaves from Africa. So the question is, how do you fill this great demand? Well, to a large extent, it's being filled by the slave exporting states of this period, Maryland, Virginia as well. So we have these kind of older slave states that continue to be committed to the institution of slavery, but are also exporting massive numbers of slaves. Maryland is certainly one of these. And so when we think about African Americans being kidnapped in Philadelphia, but also in Baltimore, free black people are being kidnapped and sold not just into Maryland, but to Georgia and to Alabama as well. So there is this real incentive for people to do this, right? There are huge amounts of money to be made in kidnapping legally free people. And so, we have these, this slave catching business is a fascinating one. It is, I don't really go into this so much in the book, but it's a fascinating business. It really is becoming kind of centralized in this period. There are these big firms in Baltimore that are engaged in slave catching and sale of these individuals to the West. There's a huge amount of money being made. But when you have that huge profit available, you're going to have an incentive to bend the rules and to, often there's a kind of plausible deniability. Well, this guy told me that he was a slave, so it's okay for me to have captured him. That's what's happening here. So there is this kind of blurry line between some of the people who are legally actual slave catchers, right? They're actually being hired by people whose slaves have absconded to go capture them in Pennsylvania. Some of these same people are also clearly kidnappers who are engaging in sort of seizing people illegally and selling them along the same lines. But some of them are captured. And that's, these laws that we see Pennsylvania passing, there are a few of them in this period, recognize this as a legitimate problem. Now, some people are going to say, oh, it's overblown, that it's not as big a problem as you claim it to be, but lots of Pennsylvanians, white Pennsylvanians, as well as, of course, African-American Pennsylvanians, see this as a real danger. And so there are kidnappers who are captured and imprisoned. And even beyond that, I think what some of these laws do is create a deterrent, right? That if there's a huge incentive to engage in this kind of activity because there are huge profits to be made, well, we need to make the consequences of doing so illegally great enough to deter them. So I think even beyond the actual numbers of kidnappers who are captured, and there are a number of them, there is this danger that is going to make people think twice before engaging in this.
Did that cause friction between Pennsylvania and Maryland?
Absolutely, because Marylanders said basically this isn't a real problem. These laws that ostensibly are about protecting black people in Pennsylvania from kidnappers are really about making it harder to recover your fugitive slaves. And in fact, there are a number of incidents where pretty clearly the person who was being sought had been a slave and was being recovered, and those people are being prosecuted as kidnappers. They're imprisoned and paying huge fines because they don't, sort of follow the letter of the law. And what Maryland is increasingly saying is that this is unacceptable. You can't continue to criminalize, these very slight deviations from the procedure that you've established. Often because doing so creates opportunity for those slaves to escape anyway, right? So, part of what these laws do in their operation is give the accused fugitive time to basically find a way out of town and disappear from the scene before the person who's pursuing them can, get all the warrants necessary and fill out all the paperwork.
We could probably spend the rest of the time talking about this subject, but I want to ask you about a couple other things. One is when you are not writing books, what do you do?
So I teach history at Towson University, which is in suburban Baltimore. So it's I did not, when I started writing this book, I did not realize that my life would become a reenactment of the travel that I depict in this book. So I actually live in Philadelphia, but I teach in Baltimore. So I'm down there a few days a week. It's a state school.
What do you teach?
So I teach African American history primarily, but I do early America and I teach the Civil War and I do urban history too. I'm increasingly drawn to the history of cities, which is certainly a part of this book, but it wasn't. I sort of didn't undertake this book as an urban history, but I'm increasingly drawn to the idea of urban history.
Now, the back cover of the book says, published in cooperation with the Library Company of Philadelphia's program in African American history. What's the Library Company of Philadelphia?
So the Library Company of Philadelphia is this amazing institution that is very old. So it was founded in part by Benjamin Franklin in the colonial period. It was founded initially as a lending library for kind of Philadelphians to have this opportunity to read material that they wouldn't have on their own. Over time, it's become a research institution. So it is a place where they still have this magnificent collection of resources going back to, their collections have expanded beyond what they even initially had. So it's got this amazing collection of really old printed resources. And it's really one of the biggest, most important centers for the study of early America out there. So it attracts scholars from across the country who come to Philadelphia in part to study at the Library Company. It's got this wonderful old reading room where you're sort of surrounded by this feel of the 18th century, even though it's actually not that old of a building. They've kind of recreated the feel of the original building, I think. And it's kind of a center. It has long been a center for the study of early America, and I think in the last few decades has really become a center for the study of early African American history as well. They had a curator there by the name of Philip Sansky, who did just sort of yeoman's work in collecting these resources on African American history that really hadn't been collected elsewhere, and as a result, it really has become a center of that field. So that's the story of. It's also right next door to another institution, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So the two together create on that block really like a center of the study of early American history.
Again, this is kind of an aside, but before we run out of time, would you talk about Robert Purvis?
So Robert Purvis is one of the most important leaders in Black Philadelphia. So he's a man of mixed ancestry, and in fact, a lot of people mistakenly believe that he is white. So they look at him; he does not sort of physically appear to be black. but he fully identified himself as a black man. And he's born into wealth, so unlike Fortin, who's a kind of self-made man, Purvis is born as his father was his white father was a wealthy cotton merchant in South Carolina, and he moves his family to Philadelphia in part because he understands that this is the best place for his mixed-race family. And Purvis is well-educated. He's a brilliant man. He is a fierce abolitionist, so he's what we call a Garrisonian abolitionist. He's a close ally of William Lloyd Garrison.
And the son-in-law of James Fortin.
Son-in-law of James Fortin. So he has all sorts of connections both to the black elite of Philadelphia, but also to the abolitionist movement nationally. So he's he's involved in a number of ways in the abolitionist movement. He gives speeches, he writes eloquently, but in addition to this is something that we haven't really talked about. He is one of the leaders in the Vigilance Committee in Philadelphia. This is this organization that is established in Philadelphia. There are vigilance committees elsewhere as well that becomes the kind of institutional support for what we today would call the Underground Railroad. So vigilance committees are, in part, they're vigilant against kidnappers, right? So that's part of their job, is to prevent the illicit kidnapping of free African Americans. But the flip side of that is that they are the institutional support for people who have run away, are looking to get further or protect themselves from slave catchers. So Purvis becomes a leader in that movement, which really, I think Philadelphia, because of its proximity to the slave states, becomes a really important place on the Underground Railroad. A lot of people who have escaped from all over the sort of the Upper South will come to Philadelphia not to stay permanently, but to move on elsewhere.
How does it's really the core of your book, the interest in free blacks in their citizenship rights evolve toward a full-blown abolitionist movement?
So I think it always exists alongside it. I think, all of these people who are advocating for black citizenship would consider themselves abolitionists as well. And there's some debate about, where this kind of disfranchisement of black people comes from. So some people are arguing that it is slavery that produces this notion that black people are degraded, and therefore we must do away with slavery if we're ever to acquire citizenship rights. There's another school of thought that says it is the denial of black people's citizenship rights that makes possible support for slavery. And so they say, well, we need to first work on bringing black Northerners up to the rights of white Northerners before we can focus on slavery. In reality, these things are happening alongside each other. So a man like Robert Purvis is an advocate for black citizenship, but he sees that fight for black citizenship as a fundamental part of his fight against slavery as well.
What became of Robert Purvis?
So he would, he lived into the post-war period. He continued his support for black rights even after the end of slavery. So he continued his advocacy for equal citizenship. So there was, the book ends in 1863 because I argue that this is a moment of fundamental change for this struggle for black citizenship. But black citizenship is not won in 1863. So there's a continuing fight after the war to fight for the franchise, to fight for other kinds of citizenship rights, to fight for schools and the kinds of things we associate more with the kind of later civil rights movement. That is happening after the war, and Purvis will be involved in that as well.
You write that Robert Purvis remains suspicious of many Republican politicians. He was worried about its members' moderation and willingness to abandon a more radical embrace of black equality. You say the New York Herald gleefully reported Purvis and other Pennsylvania abolitionists' opposition to the Republicans, expressing hope that it would lead to Lincoln's defeat.
Yeah, I think Lincoln is a useful way to think about the Republican Party because, as we were saying earlier, Lincoln is distancing himself from radical abolitionists, right? And he does so in what historian Jim Oakes has called strategic racism, right? And this comes back to what I was talking about, why colonization is so useful. Republicans like Lincoln, whatever their private convictions were, and it's always hard to get at what the private convictions of politicians are, whatever their private convictions, they recognized that politically black equality was a hard sell. And that if you were too closely associated with those who believed in full black equality, that would weaken your ability to advocate for what these men thought was the real important battle, which was against slavery expansion or slavery. Well, we can understand the political justifications for that kind of a choice, right? I think it makes sense to me, but from someone like Robert Purvis's perspective, this was a story that maybe he had heard too many times, right? Too many times he had heard, well, let's worry about these important things and we'll put aside your concerns about black equality. And, you can only hear a politician say that black people are inherently inferior and they can never be granted equal citizenship in the United States so many times before you begin to think that maybe he believes that, and maybe I'm not going to support him just because we agree that slavery shouldn't be expanded into Kansas.
Who are some of the other fascinating people you came across during this book?
So I think the person who I ultimately came out of this process of writing this book most fascinated by was a man named William Still. And I'm so fascinated that this is actually the book that I'm working on now. I'm working on a biography of William Still. He's a black abolitionist, and he becomes really the kind of acting face, the chairman of the acting committee of that vigilance committee I was talking about earlier. He becomes the moving force behind the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia. He comes from very humble circumstances. He comes from rural New Jersey. He moves, this is a sort of classic story of the 19th century, moves to the city to make his fortune. I mean, he's really not coming to Philadelphia to become an abolitionist, finds various jobs and ultimately ends up working kind of as a clerk at the Anti-Slavery Society, and very quickly distinguishes himself and becomes this, the face of the Underground Railroad. And in this capacity, takes these voluminous records, and he really leaves us with the best records that we have on the functioning of the Underground Railroad. And so he becomes this really important source for us, but he also takes on other roles as well. He becomes a public leader. And I think that really, in the book, that was one of the things that really fascinated me. We think of the Underground Railroad, and with some justification, as this clandestine organization that happens as secret. It's all about secret compartments in people's houses.
Records.
He's keeping records, which is extremely dangerous, right? I mean, if those records are found, that's going to lead potentially slave catchers to people who have escaped. He keeps them, and actually, he would eventually hide them in a cemetery. So he realized that eventually that they were so potentially dangerous that he hid them. But he shows us that this act of supporting fugitive slaves in many instances is a public act, that the people who are on the Vigilance Committee, everyone knows who they are. Their names are published in the newspaper, their address is published because they want people to know, where do you go to find these men? You need to know where to send your money if you want to support the Vigilance Committee. So he, I think, really embodies this really fascinating extent to which the operation of this clearly illegal organization is dependent upon the goodwill of white Philadelphians who aren't really that supportive of lots of the most radical actions of this group.
Well, we will have to have you back when that book comes out.
I'd love to come back.
We've been talking to Andrew Diemer. We've been talking about this book, The Politics of Black Citizenship, Free African Americans in the Mid-Atlantic Borderland, 1817 to 1863. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. We'd like to hear from you. Our email address is pabooks@pcntv.com. Like us on Facebook to learn more about PA Books.